The best way to get better at programming is through practicing. So here's a simple example of how to get data from the keyboard. You can pause this video if you'd like. That way you can practice, and then we can check our answers together. All right, so let's see how we're going to read data from the keyboard. It's going to be very simple, and we're first just going to start with getting a name, just something that's going to be string data. Whenever we read data from a keyboard, we're going to read it into a variable. So we're going to use the variable name, use the equals for assignment, and then we're going to use the input command. Now, a lot of videos and tutorials will just give you this. There is an optional parameter, however, that is very important for user friendliness, and that is we need to give it some sort of output so the person knows what to put in. Additionally, I always like to put a space after I put a colon or a question mark or something like that. That way there's some separation from where the user types and the end of my string literal as printed out. I use the print command as you see here in order to print out that value. To read numeric data, we have to ask ourselves what type of data are we going to use. So let's take, for example, something like age. Most of the time, we think of age as being a whole number. Now, Python does not have whole numbers, they have integers, and integers can be positive or negative, and so that's going to be good enough for us. We'll say equals. Now, int is a special type of function. It takes a string parameter, it's going to convert that string into an integer number, and then return it to us. That way, we can store it inside of a variable, like we have age here. Now, where do we get that string? Well, the input command always returns a string for us. If I want to store as a different type of number, something called a float, this allows us to have a decimal place. Integers cannot have decimal places. So let's look at something that's going to have a floating point value. Now, instead of int, we'll use the command float. And float's going to work the exact same way. It's going to take in a string, convert it to a floating point number, and then give us that value. Now, I'm not printing out age or height. You don't have to. It's just an example. If we go and run this, it says, please enter your name. We can say John, and because we used the print command with our variable, we see the John. How old are you? We'll say 21. Notice it took it, it stored it internally. Notice we don't see any information with it if we don't print it out. How tall am I in meters? And we exit out of this. Now, I do want to show you one potential issue. We're going to run this one more time. And we're going to say John, just like we did before. And I'm going to say, how old am I? And if you think about little kids, a lot of times they count quarter ages and half ages and stuff like that. So let's say they put in 5.5. This is not an integer. This is a floating point number because there's a decimal point associated with it. If I try to put 5.5 into int, you'll notice that we're going to get a value error. That's because it's not a valid answer for an integer value. So int doesn't chop off our decimal place, it doesn't round it or anything like that. It's going to take it as it sees it, and it's going to throw an error if we try to give it a decimal place or anything else that's not a valid integer number. The same thing's going to be true with float. If we give it something that's not numeric, now floating point will accept decimal places, but if we give it something else, it will throw an error. So that's just something we want to keep in mind when we're doing these conversions and working with Python inputs. Stay tuned for more examples of programming with Python.